Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 158, Q&A, coverage concerns, and patch method pros and cons. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the show. Happy to see you here on this Education Friday, and certainly happy to get to some of the questions you guys have had about some previous episodes recently, and some of the stuff you guys wanted to see as far as coming back to some of the underlay and coverage stuff that we've talked about before, tatami fills, whatever you call those type of filling stitches. Tatami is a classic way to call them, but there's other ones. There's wicker, there's patterns, there's every manner of filling or seeding stitch wherein we use rows of stitching to fill an area. We're going to talk a little bit about that and about coverage in general. We're going to kind of generalize. You guys know that I like to get down to the essentials and build from there the things that are elemental to embroidery. So we're going to talk about coverage because that came in as a question. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about patch method pros and cons. Pretty recently, you may have seen an article come out or on video from The Apparelist, the good folks from Printing United. The Apparelist came out and discussed some of my patch making methods. And I am not certainly the only patch maker, the only type of patch maker, or perhaps somebody who does patch making all the time. But I made quite a few patches for a lot of different reasons. And so I have some feelings about how you do these different methods and what makes sense to me. But I'm going to explain some pros and cons and see, what might make more sense to you. So we'll talk about patch making pros and cons. We'll talk about coverage. And because this is a Q&A episode, what I'm really hoping for is if you folks are here, you reciprocators, you guys who give back, that you will jump in with your questions and comments today. And hey, derail the show. Go for it. Really, today is about playing a little catch up, getting a chance to answer those questions you guys have, and walk you through some things like a method of patch making that I discussed recently and people got confused about, which is a hybrid method of doing embroidered edge patches. And so I'm going to explain that hybrid method to you. So we talk about the different methods between using soluble materials, using plastics, hot cutting. And then people were asking, all right, what else method can you use to make this work out, especially if you have some materials that don't work so great, some of the film materials that might tear easily, and I like to do a hybrid method. And the hybrid plastic, hybrid film method was something some folks had not done before, and so it's a really simple thing that I'm going to explain as we get on. However, we'll start out today with some coverage, a little talk about underlay, and just discuss kind of what we need to do to get coverage and things we should expect when we're trying to have like high contrast experiences. We've got really bright white thread on a black garment or vice versa. What does that mean? What can we do to solve those problems? And how do we in general try to increase our coverage? As well as me briefly discussing some material things that you might use as well, or that some people have used and why I do or don't use them, or haven't used them in my own career. So please jump in, bring some comments, bring your questions, and we'll have the discussion today. Like I said, Q&A day, simple kind of day. I'm hoping that you guys will have some feedback and things that you want to talk about as well on Q&A day. I should really announce these a little earlier so you can get your questions lined up, right? I'll try and remember next time. Let's say hello to some of the folks who are already here live. Like I said, if you are in the hashtag replay squad, I'm happy for you guys to be here. And if you have questions, by all means, jump in with your questions, even if it's afterwards. If it's on the replay, we try and grab those in the comments whenever we can. And sometimes if you email me or message me, your comment or question may become the topic of the next week's show. So by all means, even if you can't be here live, we love you. We'd love to have you here. Go ahead and comment. But as you know, if you're replaying, you can go ahead and fast forward for a second because I'm going to say hi to the people who are showing up live. All right, we have Cindy King out of Texas saying good afternoon. Good afternoon, Cindy. Happy to have you here as well. And we have Gail from Kingsbury showing up. Hello. She says hi to everybody. Joe Rita says hi as well. Hello, Joe Rita. Happy to have you in. Steve is coming in from Iowa. Hi, Steve. Happy to have you in as well. Marta is in from Texas. We got Texas represented in the house very well today. And we got Dennis who's saying, clap, clap, man. Applause. And hey, happy to have you in, Dennis. Thank you for being here as well, joining us on YouTube. As I said, you got questions, you got comments, stuff you want to talk about, by all means, jump in with those and we will keep on rolling. But what are we going to do today? We really are going to start out with the concept of coverage. So one of the questions that came in was, hey, if you have a really high contrast combination, something's going on where, like I said, really bright thread on a really dark garment, that's classically where you have the problem. Often with a tatami or a filling stitch of some kind, you're going to see some show through. You're going to see a little bit of grain to that piece, and you're not going to get quite as clean an output as you would like. Well, the truth of the matter is some of that stuff, I'm just going to be honest with you, isn't entirely avoidable. Super bright whites are hard to achieve in a fill stitch on a black garment with white thread. Pardon me. And the other problem you may have is when we are dealing with white thread versus black thread. So let's say we got black on white. That's a really high contrast thing too, right? You might think, okay, well, if it's super high contrast too, that's going to cause the same trouble. Well, why does that not cause the same trouble for us as white on black? Here's the case. White thread on black, white thread shows imperfections very easily, and it shows all of the shadows. What does that mean? Every time we have a stitch penetration point, every time the needle goes down, you have to remember, this is a three-dimensional thing we're doing. We are jamming a needle through the fabric. The thread is going in, down, making a loop, hooking to the bobbin, and being pulled through down to the other side of the garment. What does that mean? If we're thinking about it like we're printing a flat substrate, well, we're not. We're jamming those threads through, and that means every time where there's a stitch penetration point, the stitches next to it are sinking down. And where they're sinking down, this little area where they're sinking down is going to have a shadow in it. On the high side of that stitch, you're going to have a shine up here. We're going to have a shadow here, a shadow here. So every time the needle goes down, there's going to be a small shadow. And that often, even in the 3D representations in your software of a big white fill, is going to be shown as like a little gray spot, a little darkness at the intersection where that needle drops. Truth of the matter is, it's not always coverage that makes these things look a little bit grayer. Sometimes it's just literally shadows. What can we do to reduce those shadows a little bit? Well, we can certainly work on stitch length. Stitch length, I like to use longer stitches. When I'm doing fills, I very rarely go under 4 millimeters for my fills. If I'm trying to get nice coverage, length, and in fact, length equals loft. That's something to remember. What I mean by loft, longer stitches are going to rise higher up. The more we end up with more tension, the shorter the stitches are, they're going to pull tighter down into the garment. They're going to suck down into that garment. Longer stitches are going to lift up. We're going to get a little bit of loft. Longer stitches are loftier and shinier. That does mean this penetration points are still going to have shadows at them, but we can use a little bit of that extra length to get ourselves a less gritty, grainy, or pebbly texture in our fill. So length and loft, those are going to help a little bit. Also, we have to use the other magic word, right? We want underlay, and not just underlay. We want structural underlay. Because that's the thing. Whenever you have a little bit of loose coverage, let's talk about this again. What's coverage, right? We're talking about coverage. How much does the foreground stitching, the top stitching, cover what's behind it? And in general, how much does the embroidery design, the stitching in our design, cover the garment underneath it? That's coverage. The thing is, people then confuse that directly with density. What's density? Density is the space between lines of stitching. We know that. If we're looking at a tighter density, stitches are closer together. Looser density, stitches are further apart. That's true. Does increasing density increase coverage? Yes, it does. However, it also increases how many stitch penetrations are in a given area. It increases a little bit of the push distortion. So as we stack all the stitches on top of each other, we're getting really close to density, and they start to roll off each other. As they do that, if we get more than edge-to-edge density, like 4 points or 0.4 millimeters with 40 weight thread, we're going to start seeing more push density in the opposite angle from the stitch angle. We're going to see more of that push distortion because we're rolling stitches off each other. Thread doesn't sit on top of thread real nicely. It likes to roll off if it can. It likes to get down to a single layer when they're all in the same angle. So when that happens, things push together, we end up with more distortion. And more distortion through our garment also means that we're pushing apart the fibers, the threads in the garment itself, which means more three-dimensional distortion, more rippling, more problems. So if we go too high on density, do we get coverage? Yeah, but what do we also get? We get the thread taco, that garment where you have a logo that tacos out towards you that looks like a gremlin is reaching from the inside of the garment and trying to grab you because it curves in the angle of the fill. If the angle of the fill is horizontal, then that garment's going to curve towards you like that or pop away. We get the potato chip, the super curved garment. That is usually because we've got too much density. We're pushing it apart. We're distorting those fibers, and we're causing issues. Are we getting coverage? Sure. If we jam enough thread in, it'll cover. You're correct. You won't see the color behind it, but we're trading distortion for that coverage. So increasing density, sure, to a point. If we're using 40 weight thread, I don't like to see densities that are going too much further than 4 points. Yeah, like I said, 0.4 millimeters. If you're down to 0.36, we're starting to get pretty harsh. This is bad. 3.6 points, it's starting to get pretty rough with 40 weight thread. Depending on the thread itself, you're really starting to look at more distortion, especially get down into the threes. Hey, 2 and below is the kind of density we use to cut 3D foam. So if we're getting up to 2, we're talking about 2 threads where every 1 would be. If we're talking about trying to get exactly edge-to-edge coverage, that's double that. That's the kind of stuff we use for 3D foam, up in the 2 points, 1.8 points, or 0.2 mils, 0.18 mils. That's the kind of density you want for 3D foam. So you got to think, we have that range in between there. Most of the time we want to arrive at our top density. It's somewhere around that 0.4 or 4 embroidery points for a fill stitch. That's really what we're looking to get, because that's edge-to-edge coverage just about. Now, the thing I'm going to tell you is threads are a little different. Different colors sometimes are a little different. Sometimes over-dyed threads can be a slightly different thickness. Different colors, because of the contrast, can be a little different for how much they show coverage. This is why I say density doesn't equal coverage, and we don't have to add density necessarily to get coverage. Coverage just means how much can we no longer see the color behind the piece. So I know I'm going a little bit cerebral and talking too much about all these definitions, but I want to make sure that everybody remembers when we're looking for more coverage, there's more ways to get it than just tucking into the density. Don't get me wrong. You're up at 5 points, 0.5 mils, and we're using 40 weight thread. Yeah, you can still add some. You've got room. You've got room to add more density, add more density to it, to add more lines of stitching to that piece to get them closer together. And you're still going to be okay and not be causing tons of distortion. But in order to get coverage, we don't really need that necessarily. What we need to do is to cover the underlying cover. The underlying color needs to be covered up and needs to be obscured. So how do we obscure it? Well, of course, we can add density that's going to obscure it. But the other good thing we can do is add structural underlay. And so underlay, we all know what underlay is. Underlay is underneath the top stitching. But when I say structural underlay, I mean we add underlay in a specific way that supports the structure of the top stitching and helps to lift it off the surface and helps to increase coverage, right? So these are the kind of things we're going to work on. We want to get more coverage. We want to get increased obscuring of that background material. Putting more thread on top, it's going to help, but we don't have to do it in the same angle and stitch type as the top stitching for it to work. So what we're really looking to do is obscure the background. So we literally cover it, put thread between us and the garment, add some loft, so longer stitches on the top stitching, and lift up that top stitching by having underlay underneath it. And we're using structure. So the underlay itself will be contrary to the angle of the top stitching, both so that we're not jamming everything in the same angle, we're getting all that distortion, but also so that the top stitching literally is sitting on top of your underlay in a structural fashion. If it's edge on underlay, then it sits on top of it. If we're on the outside edge of a curve, we're also getting some edge support, and we're covering up that less dense outer edge of the curved satin stitches. If we're using a turning fill stitch, a turning radial fill, same thing. Or on a fill stitch, we're usually using multiple lines of underlay, generally in the form of some sort of tatami underlay or fill style underlay to get the coverage. So structural underlay is going to be a big part of that too. Structural underlay, getting ourselves some loft, obscuring the background, and as I always say, increasing underlay before density. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the comments real quick, make sure there's nothing else I've run past, and I'm going to then show you my most famous example of that, and then run you through a couple design pieces, just elements to show you what I'm talking about, and define it one more time and make sure that it's clear, as well as showing you a couple other options people have used to get coverage that aren't about the digitizing, that aren't about the stitching themselves. So we'll take a couple of questions here first too and make sure what's going on. We'll go ahead and grab a couple of these comments. Got Zero saying hi. Happy to have you in. Cindy has another thing. She said, I'm not having fun cleaning up a cap with puff. Doing multicolor puff with white for my puff. It's a lot harder cleaning white with red and royal on top of the white puff. Absolutely. If you can get puff in the higher density version with a color that is closer to your top, absolutely. Sometimes people get away with a medium gray because sometimes it's not quite as bad just to have less contrast, but you want to have the least contrast you can manage. If the puff is the same color as the top, that's great. The problem is some of the really nice high density puffs don't have multiple colors. All right. Eartha says, hello from Louisiana. Happy to have you in, Eartha. And then Dennis says, what if the client thinks they know what full coverage is for the white fill and a black hat? I'd use the same settings at 0.3 density with a double tatami underlay, still complaining about coverage. That one is super difficult. I got to tell you, it is super difficult because if the customer is looking at it and they just don't like the fact that white has shadows, we got a different problem because honestly, if unless they can show it to you, there's something that we got to deal with. And in fact, I've had this point where I just say, all right, cool. Do you have a sample of what you've had done before? Especially if somebody does this. This is just me being serious. This is the commercial world, what I dealt with. People coming to me and saying, nope, I got another guy who does it. I said to them every single time, if you can show me that garment, if you have that example, bring it to me and I'll do it. Because 9 times out of 10, they didn't have it. They believed it was somebody else had something that was different, or I found out that it had some other sort of support material or something else in it that was making it look different. So that's the other thing we can talk about. We're going to talk about this in a minute. You can use toppers or support materials to absolutely cover the material behind something, or you can use applique, which is what I've done a few times to try and make it exactly super bright white behind the piece. But if they just don't like the texture of the fill stitch, now we just got an issue. The thing is, sometimes they'll bring it to you or they'll bring you the sample and it's in satins. And I'm like, yeah, if you got satins and we're transitioning to a logo that doesn't work with satins and it's fills, satin stitches are unbroken and don't have the shadows in the middle. That's going to be an issue. If they just don't like the texture of a fill stitch, no matter what type of stitch that is that you're using to do that filling, that's an issue where it's a client communication issue. But I've flatly said, if you can bring me the previous guy's sample, or even if it's a different logo, if they'll release you the DST file and have that brought to me, you can get me that DST file. I can replicate anything anyone else can do. But if they're just believing that there's a different color of white that doesn't exist, sometimes that's an issue. But I will say there's toppers. In fact, I'm going to stop and talk about that real quickly. Because you already kind of said, you're using the double tatami underlay, which is rough. That's something that I was always going to show. I mean, everybody always asks me, what do I use? And frankly, that's what I often use. I use the double tatami underlay. When we're looking at this piece here, this is the one that I always show. The PW on top, what's the difference between the top one and the bottom one? Literally, the top one has single tatami underlay. You can actually see kind of the rows of the underlay through the piece a little bit. If you kind of follow my cursor there, you can see the angles of it. But the bottom one has double tatami. And that's part of the problem. If we're dealing with that, and like I said, this is a nice double tatami underlay, or it can be called a double diagonal. It can be called a fill underlay, a mesh underlay. It depends on your software if you're using automatic underlay, so it might be. At the same time, when we're looking at this piece, you're right. Sometimes they're seeing the texture. And if you look at this piece down here, this one's nice. It's got a light texture. We're on a light garment. So I'm trying not to get ripples, so I'm not going above a certain density. But it does still have some texture, and that's the problem. If you're pointing that out, that's an issue. What I will say is, the last time we were here, we talked about cover-ups. And one of the things I've done previously, and I'll go ahead and pull the screen down so I can try and bring it back up, is I've used applique to do the backgrounds for pieces like that. And sometimes especially if it's a big piece, it's a filled piece where applique makes sense, still a hardcore. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah, and that's what you're saying too. You're saying the bottom one, they still would say it's not full, and that's just not true. I mean, that's the thing. And also, I'll tell you this. If you're on a performance wear garment and you go 0.3, you go to like 30 point, like you're talking about, you are going to see curvature, you're going to see rippling. And that's at a point where we're talking to a customer who wants a print. If they want a print, or if they want something like that, you may have to work on that. That's literally just texture. That's actually a good looking white fill on black. There's nothing wrong with that sample. So I would have to say, yeah, that's when we're talking to a customer and the customer is just being unreasonable, there comes a point where you have to go, all right, this is as much thread as you can throw at it. It's going to get destroyed. I wouldn't make this in a worse way for you. Now, I will show you what the home market does. I'm just going to bring this up before I finish out talking about the underlay or about the other the applique versions that I've done. I will just pop that up and let you know. But here's the thing that I'm going to show you really briefly. This is what the home market does, not something that I've usually done. Now, nothing wrong with home market solutions if it works for you, but I'm charging the customer more to mess with this stuff. And that's this. They will use a permanent topping. Now, why am I showing you this on Embroidery Online from OESD? Because this is not something I see being used by a lot of commercial shops. What is this? This is literally just a permanent layer of plastic topping that is colored that will hold back any color from underneath it. You rip it away before you do a final logo edge. So literally you're running it on top. These are just 8x9 sheets. This is not something that's made for mass commercial adoption, or at least this in this package. I've also seen people use tearaway stabilizer on top. I cannot tell you how much I don't like that. It's not that you can't do it. It's not that it won't work or it won't provide the coverage you want, because we are doing the thing we're talking about. We're obscuring that background. But unfortunately, yeah, obscuring the background at the cost, especially of, if we've got it on a lighter garment, this isn't, I mean, on a hat, okay, fine. We use extra material on a hat, we're not really gonna feel it, but on a lighter garment, it's a little weird. And honestly, I'm adding another stage of tearing or prep or something like that to the process. And I'm gonna have to get paid for that extra stage of prep, that extra work that I'm doing. This is more like we're doing a 3D foam piece now. By the time I'm having to run on top of these top cover sheets and then tear stuff out and finish the edges, we're in the realm of something being like doing 3D foam. And frankly, on a hat, you got to wonder if that's what they're really looking for. And honestly, even on 3D foam, you're going to see texture, you're going to see shadows if we have a fill stitch. There's no way not to have texture on a fill stitch. If it's literally just the shadows and the texture, these are the kind of people who want to print. I'm going to go get them one of the embossed pieces like Stahl's or World Emblem does these embossed heat press pieces. You want one of those, or flocking or something else. We got to try and get something else for you. If you really just can't tolerate the fact that thread looks like thread, that's kind of an issue. But I will say the other thing I have done for folks, I'm going to see if I can pull this up real quick. I had a little problem, little technical issues when we were first coming up here today. So we're going to take a look and see if I can grab the other thing that I talked about last week with doing cover-ups, is that you can also do pieces that just have an applique as part of them. Now, there's multiple ways you can go about that. In the case of the one piece I'm talking about here, it was also for getting really fine detail on garments that had a pretty decent amount of texture. And in this case, I'll go ahead and show this real quickly. This is the one that I'm talking about, done for the folks, the custodial department for San Ildefonso Puebla, I believe. So I have to remember who did this up. This custodial department here, they had this piece. It was going on mostly polo shirts, but some of them were like super basket weave. Some of them had more texture. This one is just a piqué polo shirt, so it would have held up just fine. But they wanted super clean, fine, straight stitch lines. They wanted this thing brought down from the logo that was originally about 3.5 inches down to a little under 2.5 inches. And by the time I had to bring it down to these sizes, I was looking at doing applique. I showed them applique on the larger size, and then I pulled it even further down after the fact. And they didn't want a full patch style look, but if you'll see here, I did this as an applique. This was actually stitched through the applique, which was fine in this case, but you can also do the what I call the hybrid method, which I'm going to talk about in the patch making portion of this too, where you stitch all the stuff that's inside the center of the patch area, the applique area first, do your cutout method, whether that's hot cut or laser or whatever it is that you're going to use for your cutting, or literally jamming on it with a scissor, not a problem. And then we go out and use an applique style placement and a full cover satin edge to put this down after the fact. For a super complicated shape, this is going to be less attractive. For complicated letters, something like that, this is going to be much less attractive. You can do this either just open, like this one is, just open with untextured twill direct, where you can see the twill as the background, or you can do this with a partial coverage. And we can also kind of show that as well. I believe we got a piece we can bring up for the partial coverage. We can use a half or even less density coverage to make it look more like a fully filled piece. So that's something else we can do that's kind of, it can be useful. But once again, it's not necessarily everything we want. It is certainly going to cause more labor. It's impossible not to have more labor when we're doing any of these methods. And invariably, that's the other trade-off. We're going to have to charge for that kind of stuff. This one is another version where I had to do a very large, fully filled area that they wanted to look like it was completely stitched. And you guys have probably seen this before if you've been on the show for a while. And this was on the back of a fairly light mesh polo style shirt. And if we see this piece right here, you can see, if we zoom in real close, you'll see this, the full density, as we can see, that's in the middle of like city here, that's in the eye. That's what the full density would be. And you can see how much less it is, like half or less density that's in this background. However, that thread does make it look more like a fully filled area. And I've got a nice big blue applique underneath it that causes the extra coverage without getting the distortion. So the issue really here is trying to figure out what's going to make sense for you and what's going to make sense for the customer and still be, commercially viable. Because really, when I'm looking at this piece, if they're going to say that this much shadow inside of the P&W is too much and that's not real coverage, and that is not a lot of shadow, not a lot of texture, and I'm zoomed in real tight on this piece, you can see from the, this is not a super thick PK Polo. We are really tight on the piece, and we're on a detail shot, and this is on a piece of moisture wicking polyester shirt. So this is not super, super heavy texture. We zoom back from this piece from any distance, and I'm telling you, this is not heavily textured. They think that's not full coverage. I think you're going to have a problem with them forevermore. I mean, that's going to be an issue. I'd be looking for certainly to do mesh style underlays, certainly help. The other thing you can do, this mesh style under you're looking at here, and admittedly, I was just testing this on the little home machine sitting next to me, and I wanted to show it in the middle of the run. This mesh, and in fact, I can bring this up when we're over in the software. We'll bring up this mesh. We look at this piece here. This is like 40 points. I mean, this is really, it's 4 mils between from one line over the second to the third. This is a really, really loose mesh. 30 to 40 points is normal for these, but you can increase that as well. You can bring up that mesh count and make it smaller. I recreated this piece also in Stitch Artist. You can see what the settings are. This piece was done in Wilcom earlier on in my career, but I kind of recreated it very quickly just to show you what I'm talking about, because it may be different settings depending on the software you're on. If you were in Stitch Artist, like we are here, that would be turning on diagonal 1, diagonal 2. You can see that these are just preset setups, but in this case, I've got them at 40 points. That's super broad. You can always make that tighter. You drop them down to 30. That's really not crazy amounts of extra stitching, but it would provide more coverage as it's going to get a little bit tighter and denser. And the great thing to notice here, if I've got my fill stitch that's on here, and we'll go back to the stitching, it's a little too small. I would usually go up to a 4mm fill or more. We drop our stitch points though here. We can kind of see even on that wide density, if we follow one stitch, we've got a point here that we're trying to follow. And one stitch we'll see crosses 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of the underlying stitching because of about how that spacing is. That means any one stitch is likely to cross 3 or 4 stitches that are holding it up. That does provide some coverage. And like I said, when we're looking at the original example, it makes a big difference between this or having just a single fill style underlay. In the case of this one, we turn these off. We only have perpendicular underlay. You can see every one of these stitches maybe hits 3 that cross, but different angles may interact differently. When we have a full diagonal, it also lays out the fabric very nicely as we run up one side, down the other, the 2 angles, and we end up where we get kind of a more likely hit for any particular part of the fill, the top fill, or any top stitching. It's likely to hit good, solid coverage underneath and to ride up above the base layer. So we're getting opaqueness, we're getting that coverage there. And like I said, you really end up completely outside of it. You can't get that to work out for you. They're not happy. Then the other thing we can do is a full applique. And in that case, you do something like, you can do this like you do with the folks here at Say, where I just had a full placement. We ran that right through. And in that case, of course, you just got yourself a placement line, a tack down, and then we run the rest of the design and finish out the piece. And I mean, that is one of the versions. That is actually the undecorated smallest version that they did of that piece. But you can do a full applique as that coverage, or like I showed you previously, the other great way to handle that is to do that half density applique where we put a small density of fill stitch underneath the main body of the piece to provide texture, and we match that color to the applique. Not perfect, but it's one of the options we have. And like I said, there are other things you can do. You're very unlikely to find me doing it, but they do have things like that top cover, that permanent topping. This does exist. I'm not trying to add more necessarily more labor to my piece if I don't have to, because this is something that's going to cost money. It's going to cost time. It's going to have me doing a lot more work. And it really does make any piece more tantamount to working on a 3D foam piece than it is like working on standard embroidery. So yeah, I know it's kind of rough like that, and it's kind of hard to figure that stuff out sometimes. That people are sometimes you just have problem clients, and I say, yeah, I hate to say it. When you're pointing out penetration points, you're probably not going to get much better. By the way, AJ, the Eric show, maybe I should just change to the Eric show, right? Some people say that. The funny thing is what they usually say, because I keep you guys so long and lecture so hard, they go, what are you doing for this week's class? And I'm like, man, if these are classes, I should be telling the people at the trade shows that I do class every week and they should come pay up for that, right? No, I want you guys to be here and get the work done. So yeah, AJ, trouble client. Yeah, I feel like it. So AJ also says, here's something interesting. We've got some comments. We'll bring in some customer comments and some client comments as we talk about this stuff. But you said, I massacred a 3D puff hat to see how they did their underlay. Love it. I have done the same thing. Tear apart hats, tear apart garments, and see how people do it. It helps. I cut open a champion satin stitch and saw that they did an underlay that allowed the satin to be raised. Yes. Absolutely. There are multiple satin style underlays that can allow them to be raised. The one thing I'm going to warn you about, if you see something called a 3D satin, will come as a 3D satin. There's other softwares that do something similar where they run a narrow satin and then a slightly wider one and then another slightly wider one, and it's building up on the front side. Remember that it's also building up on the back side. You're building up that much bobbin thread as well. I had somebody who had a nice hat that's like my military hats, where they're very tight fitting. And what you'll find is you're going to brand someone's forehead, because if you build up all those layers, it's also building up the other direction. And you're going to end up with also some extra thickness on the back. Lots of reasons that's not a problem for different types of work. If you're doing patches that are going to go on something else, probably doesn't matter much. You're doing it on outerwear where we're not expecting it to be right close to the skin, not going to matter so much. You do it on a really nice tight hat that rides against the forehead, and you're going to find that you're going to brand somebody with their logo in the back. You're going to pull pull that off, and on their forehead they got whatever letter was on the front of the hat. So not something that you always have to worry about. But when you're building up the super thick 3D satins that are just satin stitch on top of satin stitch, might want to watch it. That's why I like what we call the German underlay, and I can actually bring that up. Edge run plus double zigzag, and then we increase density on the zigzag when we're trying to get that working. I mean, usually we're talking about fill underlay, and I'm going to pop that up as well. But when we're into satin underlays, I do like the German or the edge run plus double zigzag. That's the one that I love the most. It's a contour underlay that's just a little inset with that double zigzag on top. Multiple softwares call it different things. This is a great one just to give you a little bit of raised dimension. And then I'm actually going to show you another one for split satins that can help you when you get coverage problems inside of a split satin or a turning radius fill that's on a column. We'll talk about that in a second, contour underlay. But in this case, and that's a manually built contour underlay. But yeah, edge walk plus double zigzag is great. And just to recover it again, hey, fill underlays, fills are great. Mesh fills, they're great for a high contrast color. But like I said, eventually you are going to come across the people who may or may not just like the texture of embroidery. If they don't like it, then we got to do something else. Coverage can help, but make sure you're charging clients correctly for that kind of stuff, because we really are. Once we're starting to add materials, we got issues. At the very least, we have issues with what we're being paid, I think. So like I said, we'll have to see. Jurgia says, I have two identical objects with both 16-point density. Why can't I get the top one in between the bottom one? Generally, depending on your software, the stitches are going to be laid on a grid when they're first generated. They'll lay up on the same rows. You grab that one of the objects and you tap it down a couple points by selecting the object, and you tap it down with your arrow keys, and you can get them to fall into each other perfectly. Otherwise, it really depends. Different software have different ways of how they place a fill stitch within a shape. If it has the underlying method where we always have the lines lining up against a grid that is imagined, that's kind of behind the scenes programmed into the software, in the canvas, if you will, then when we have lower densities, they're going to stay on the same lines. Most software does that. So when I do gradients and I want them to fall exactly into each other, then what I do is make the two objects, and yes, everything lines up exactly, and then I just offset the object slightly. Yes, there'll be a little offsets top and bottom and sides. Usually I'm using a border or something to cover when I have a lot of gradient work, or I go ahead and let there be a little bit of softness in those edges and hide that, or do manual work to clean it up. Because when we're trying to get exact perfect blending and stuff, there usually has to be a little bit of manual work to get it just perfect. Go ahead and generate the fills, then grab the object. Don't regenerate it. Don't change the points or drag the points up and down. Grab the entire object, tap it down a little bit, and you're going to get that perfect layout that you're looking for. So I've got a couple more comments before I jump back in. Yosta says hi from Sweden. Hi, Yosta. Happy to have you in. Sunrise Tactical. Scott so rolled in late. Happy to start the holiday with Eric. Thank you. And glad to have you guys all in. Sharon says hi from OKC. Happy to have you here too. Ramona's happy to get in. Glad to have you here. And yeah, can't stand that 3D satin. 3D satin's rough. I'm there with that too. And then Mike says, that's not as bad as the snapback tan line, but would be pretty uncomfortable. I got to say, as someone with not a lot on the top of the dome, what I found out is mesh hats, not so useful as they used to be, my friends. When you lose what's on top, you got to cover it up. Anyway, and then, yeah, AJ, I was watching it like, yep. All right. So, like I said, there's some stuff that we can still work on. Underlays are useful. Let me get a little bit more about the coverage real quickly. I have one more type of underlay that I always like to mention because one of the other things I want to remind you guys is that underlay is anything you build that is structural. You can use multiple objects to build it. You don't just have to use settings that are in your software. Any way you build stitching that is structural that supports stitching on top is underlay and is valuable. And one of the things that I talk about a lot and that I always do manually because it's not offered in software that I know of at the very least is to do a contour column fill underlay on split or link limit satin stitches. So let me bring that up and just explain that. I know I've probably showed you before, but it's something that I found incredibly useful. If you have to use a split style, auto split, or other kinds of link limited satin stitch underlay or satin stitch column, you have a nice wide column like this. It's super wide. It's too wide for just having a straight satin stitch across for whatever reason that you're working on your piece. And you find out that your double zigzag, it's working, but boy, I'm having to put a lot of density to try and get coverage, and I'm still having some issues in the center because if we turn on our stitch penetration points, we can see we've got all these kind of offset penetration points, and we'll have entire stitches inside of this piece that don't have any loft underneath them. They're sinking in, and they don't necessarily have any sort of stitch underneath them because that big zigzag leaves these diamonds that are open where we don't have anything underneath that column. So if we look at that piece one more time, we'll go ahead and drop those points back out. That auto split, that length limit inside of that edge padding, the zigzags just leave a lot of room so that every once in a while a stitch will drop inside of those open diamonds, even when we use extremely high density. And this is high density for the underlay. My density for underlay makes them usually look like nice big square diamonds. They're squares turned on their sides. Not so much like these really flat diamonds that we're seeing here. That's a lot of underlay, and we're still seeing as we zoom in individual stitches that are dropping inside of that piece and not getting anything to lift them up or hold them up. So what I will often do is create my own. So let's go ahead and drop these points out. You can already see what I'm talking about. This is drawing two different objects. So that's the thing that gets people is they're like, well, it's not an underlay style because it's not in the underlay menu. Well, it doesn't have to be an underlay menu. In the case of this piece, I draw myself a column that is just inside the size of the other column. So I draw this piece. This C is a slightly narrower version of the C shape that's on top of it. And I create a contour fill to that column. So instead of it being a normal column stitch, a normal satin stitch, I use contour. In this case, for stitch artists, that would be contour 1. And I use that contour. In this case, it actually has, my travels aren't good and I need to fix this. This one jumps over. I didn't check that in the sample before I brought it up. So I know I did this one on the fly when I was at a show trying to show somebody the difference between building your own and using the double zigzag. But as you can see, as we stitch across this piece, if I go ahead and put my stitch penetration points back on, at no point is there a stitch that doesn't have at least a couple of rails of this fill underneath it. And it is exactly like having a single tatami stitch fill underneath the piece as it turns. So imagine this like a fill stitch. If you look at the angles, it's contrary. It's 90 degrees from the, or roughly thereabout from the top angle of the stitching. It's always going to be contrary to that top stitching, perpendicular to it. So this can help with the penetration points and some of that show through that can happen in the middle of these kinds of columns. And in fact, I don't hate it on just a wide satin stitch too. It just provides extra color coverage. And when we have, say, lighter densities, having that contour style fill can really help. And the great thing is, depending on the kind of software we're running or what exactly we're trying to do with it, we might be able to just use the existing piece. We'll use the existing C shape that's there and then say, all right, I want a border or a contour. I want to shrink or expand. We can shrink that shape in by, 0.5 millimeter, 0.8 mils, create a new shape, and then say, I want this to be a contour style column fill. So just to show you once again what it looks like, it's essentially a standard contour, goes back and forth in the column, and then we will run our stitching on top of that. And as you can see, it just provides the things we need. It provides structure, it provides loft, and that's going to give us more color coverage. And of course, it also just literally is there. It's between the other stitches, and we can, of course, go higher density on this if we have to, and we can balance. We can lower the density on top when we increase the density in the underlying stitches, depending on what we're trying to get as far as our coverage. Also, it really depends on the thread that's on top. Just like we talked about with that white thread shows the most shadows. White and gold have a tendency to really show shadows. It can be great when you're trying to get dimension, but poor when you're trying to get color coverage to look exactly smooth and bold and white like you want. You might have some issues with those light colors. But if we're dealing with something that's got less contrast, we're black on gray, we're in the same color family, we're in warm colors together or cool colors together, you might not need that much density to get it, especially if we're dark colors on top of lighter colors, because the shadows then help. They don't hinder. Shadows on the darker colors are not messing the color up, are not making it look rough or gray. They are just helping to shadow, to darken the thing. And in fact, lifting that thread up from the base with the structural underlay makes even more difference when we're dealing with dark thread on top of lighter colors. But that's the thing. It's the same thing as doing like straight stitch text. We've talked about this a million times. Little tiny straight stitch text, if you do it in white, or straight stitch details and grading style details, you do them in white or light colors on dark, they look stitchy and broken. But if you do them on black or with black thread on white substrates, light substrates, that darker thread, whatever the dark color thread is going to look more complete, less bumpy, stitchy, broken, because the shadows are not going to break up the color. But white thread, especially on black garment, is always going to cause some sort of texture to be there. But this can help. Like I said, that is a helpful thing we can use. As with the mesh fill underlay, as with the rest of that kind of texture, it can be useful to kind of work with that stuff. And like I said, it's not, is it going to be perfect? Is it going to be everything we want out of it? Likelihood is no. Unfortunately, it's not going to make it look glossy. It's not going to completely take it out, but it is going to help. And I think one of the things that we can look at as far as that too is just, I'll remind you guys that the swatch test is always very useful. And I'll bring one of them up again and just show you, if you're trying to achieve that perfect coverage, sometimes a swatch test is just the best thing. Start from your lowest density, in this case, like about half density or less, go to your full density, keep your underlay at the same settings, and just move through, increasing a little bit per swatch, and you'll end up with a perfect amount of coverage. In this case, I was working with some spun polyester thread that has a little fuzz to it that I had never worked on before. And in working on that thread, I wanted to make sure exactly what kind of coverage I would get. If that's the other thing, if you have fuzzier threads are going to get a higher coverage with lower densities, because the fuzz tends to kind of meld together the rows of stitching. And in this case, fuzzier thread is going to run thicker and kind of be more continuous. You can end up with some pretty decent coverages, much less than full density. And even when you're not using something of that nature, this is actually a fairly low contrast situation. We've got a khaki garment with full black fills, and I think that the coverage over in this square is about as good as the coverage over in this square, the bottom right. When we're looking at that, that's about 18% less density on the left-hand side than on the right-hand side on that bottom row. And in that case, we do get something back, but that swatch test can help us kind of dial that in. And just so I'm showing you this one where I'm not changing the underlay. The other thing you can do is leave the same density on the top stitching and just increase the underlay stitching until you see a coverage you like. The swatch isolation of whatever it is you're trying to test doesn't have to be underlay. The isolation is so you don't change a bunch of stuff and you get somewhere where you're actually adding too much stitching, even too much stabilizer or support material if you're testing multiple types of materials or whatever it is you're trying to test. You only want to change one thing at a time so you can kind of arrive at the settings that make the most sense for you. In this case, you could do the same swatch and say, let's say we have some texture that looks okay but not perfect, maybe like over here, the left second to bottom row. And you're like, well, it's not great. The coverage is not perfect, but it's better. Or maybe one in from there. We can also then decide to keep that density level and then see how much more underlay it would take to get coverage without packing more density into that same angle. All these things are viable. It's all about testing to see what makes sense for your thread and the particular kind of piece you're looking for. So yeah, that's coverage. I think we'll go ahead and leave coverage at that, but I'll go ahead and kind of give you one more time the things to think about when we're trying to increase coverage or perfect their coverage. Certainly, the thing everybody reaches for is density. density really needs to be a function of how much thread we can pack in without causing distortion. And if we're talking about 40 weight thread, which we usually are, that's the upper reaches shouldn't be too much beyond 0.4 millimeters or 4 embroidery points. We get into the threes and we're starting to get pretty rough. We're starting to add extra texture to the top, which is actually going to cause some other shadows. If we have literally stacked thread, especially we'll get satins that have too much texture on them. Sometimes that's because we're literally stacking thread too deep to the point where it's rippling. It's not actually kind of laying flat the way it should. And honestly, you're just going to get distortion in the garment itself, especially on light garments. So watch your density. But for coverage, what we're really trying to do is cover the underlying cover. How can we do that? We obscure it, not only through density, but through structural underlay. And we're trying to get some loft, so longer stitches, long stitches in the underlay, and then structural underlay that goes at an opposite angle, some kind of opposing angle to the top stitching so that it lays on top of it and doesn't fall together. And then the other thing to remember is when it is possible whatsoever, try and increase your density increase your underlay before you increase your density past that full coverage mark, past that 0.4 mils or 4 embroidery points with 40 weight thread. If you're on 60 weight thread, it's going to be about 25% higher than that. So do remember, if you're filling with 60 weight thread, most of the time you'll see people actually fill with 40 weight and then just do detail work in 60. Remember that that's part of it. And last but not least, the other thing I'm just going to briefly mention about coverage, do remember that if you're not using either temporary toppings or underlay that's going to help you with this, the texture of the underlying garment can absolutely affect coverage. And especially, this is the one that I see over and over again, if you've got something that has a vertical rib texture like a knit shirt, t-shirts, jersey knits have these vertical ribs. They're small, but they exist. And if you then put a vertical fill on top of them, they try and suck in. They try and move. They stretch the garment apart because the angle of push will be here and here. If our stitch angle is completely vertical, it pushes to these sides. And in a knit garment, the tube of that knit garment that you're looking at is going to stretch horizontally most. It's going to really stretch easily horizontally, spreading those ribs apart and letting the fill fall in. And what that ends up doing, you split up your fill a little bit and you end up with vertical kind of chatter from those ribs. And especially at the edges look really rough and you'll see color through those edges. So watch your stitch angle in relation to textures that are in your garment as well. Because really, ultimately, we cannot forget at any point that we're sticking needles through fabric. We are pulling thread tight into the fabric. Temporary toppers can help. I showed you the permanent toppers sometimes people use. Yeah, that'll obliterate the color underneath it if you have to. The other thing you can do is use steam away temporary toppers, because temporary toppers, Solvay is the kind of the popular name we use, but any sort of water soluble thin film that we put on top. If you have any texture in your garment, I would recommend using those. It does keep the thread temporarily from sucking down into the fabric, and because it does that, even after we steam it away, the thread has been kind of set its loops at that tension. It's not going to keep pulling in. The tension is released from that garment. It's no longer pulling once it's off the machine. It's not trying to keep sucking down into that garment in the same way that it is when it's running. Even when we steam away or wash away that topper, we're still going to have a little bit more loft on those top stitches than we did. Just remember that those things all interact, and that can be something to think about. All right. Going to say hi. Hi, Jesse. Hi, happy to see you in as well. That's true. Glad to see all the people here talking. Let's go into the next thing. There's just a set of questions that I had after somebody saw one of my patch articles, and previously we talked about some different patch methods. Like I said, I am not the end-all, be-all in patches. There are people who do more of them than I do, but I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons. So let's get back to it again. We have patch style pros and cons, so patch method pros and cons. And in this case, the first thing I'm going to make clear for you guys again, I'm talking about what we call embroidered edge patches. So I am not talking about the conventional method of cutting out a patch and then running the edge through an embroidery or through a marrowing machine, an overlock machine for the edging. That's a traditional method, totally great way to do it, nothing wrong with it. But the specific article we're talking about is the multiple methods of getting a clean edge off of an embroidery machine. That's what we're talking about today. So patch method pros and cons is really about which of these methods make the most sense for you and what are the pros and cons that you might encounter in these different methods. So I'm hoping to go ahead and just talk about a few of those. And if I can bring in some support kind of materials to show you. I'm going to bring in some other materials from my classes about making small run patches. And so that's, like I said, it's something that we can discuss, but I'm going to very briefly kind of just bring in patch styles and just show you. But this is really going to be pros and cons of the different styles. So we all know soluble methods using a soluble material, plastic method using a plastic or other sort of film like polyolefin film, which I'll talk about in a moment, to tear it out after the fact. And there's, of course, the hot cut method where we're stitching an entire span and cutting around it. But the one that I don't often talk about and don't have a lot of materials that I've shared on is the hybrid method. And that's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more today. And that's the applique style pieces that I kind of discussed earlier in putting pieces on garments that can't take a lot of stitching. But patch method pros and cons, just briefly, I'm going to run through some patch stuff. I'm going to show you some of the slides that I have from my patch deck. So, overlock edge patches, we're not going to talk about those that are traditional style. So, yeah, this is not what we're talking about, but that's how it's done. That's a mirroring machine. If you ever wonder how the old classic style patches are done and you're not somebody who does emblems, this is how they were done. They're run on an entire span of material, cut out of that span in multiple different ways. There's multiple ways that's done. And then they're edged manually by running them underneath the edge of this overlocker. So very much, if you know what a serger is, an overlocker, of course, is going to be similar. That's another overlock edge. And in this case, they are specifically made and have cams to make the marrowing edge that we talk about. That's the brand marrow machine that you're looking at. So that requires some skill. You can get overlock edge blanks that already have the overlock edge. That's one way. But we're talking about embroidered edge patches made with an embroidery machine. So the pros, like on embroidered edge patches in general, make them in-house, custom color, shape, and size, potentially less manual labor depending on the materials you're using instead of running them through by hand. And the other pro for embroidered edge patches is if you want an edge that looks somewhat like a mirrored edge, but you have holes inside of your patch that you want to be edged, you can't really do that on a marrow machine. As you can imagine from trying to run that edge through, you're not going to end up doing little holes or tiny insets on those patch edges, and turning corners can be hard. Embroidered edge patches remove that, but they trade that for having to use support materials and other stuff like that. Also, it's interlock. The back is always going to show a little bit of bobbin. But that's the thing. A couple different reasons that there are a couple different ways they're done and reasons why you might choose a certain way. It has to do with where we want to spend our time and what kind of work we're trying to do. This right here, that's soluble material. That is a water soluble material that's going to rinse away that I'm using for this sample. But a lot of people don't want to use water soluble because that means washing the patches, having to rinse them out, waiting for them to dry. And depending on how you're doing that, you may still then have to do some post cutting. If you're putting support materials on the back or adhesives on the back, you're still maybe doing some cutting or doing hot peel tears that are kind of a pain to put support material on the back. For sew-on patches that you don't want to have a tremendous amount of body, or if you're using, like, say, crinoline, you can do cut piece crinoline on here as well. These can require some pre-cutting if you're using fabrics, or it can cause some other issues where you're having to do post-cutting, like I said, to add other support materials. But a lot of people do hot knife. Hot knife cutting is great because you can do this. You run a ton of patches in a big sash, and they're all finished, including the edge in most cases. And in that case, you're going to use a hot knife, which is just like essentially like a wood burning tool to cut around the edge. But you have to then use materials that will melt, like polyester, that fuse. And you can use that hot knife to cut the edge out. So why do I not always recommend hot knife cutting? Pros and cons, right? Here's the deal. Pros, less specialty digitizing. Any design, including one that has a very thin border. You don't have to use super thick borders. Some people like to use reinforced borders that have an extra density to the satin edge border, but you don't have to use a super thick border to do this. And some people are using lasers to do something similar by doing precise placement. But even if we're just talking about hot knife, you don't have to use specialty borders. You can stitch everything all at once. You don't pre-cut the material, so it's very stable in the hoop. It's not going to tear out prematurely, which the plastics can do. So plastic or film style materials can tear out prematurely if you treat them too roughly. And this does seal the edge against fraying. And when we get these off the span, some people will go ahead and press in support materials or their adhesive sheets all in one big piece. And then after that's all pressed out, they cut through everything, including the adhesive with the patch knife or with the hot knife, making the patch complete in essentially one step. It's a manual step, but it's one step. So what are the pros here? Really, it's about having that process make sense for the final outcomes, for being able to cut, like I said, cut through multiple layers, and to run the patches without having any chance of tear out or slippage or any of the other problems that can happen or misplacement. Let's say we're doing pre-cut pieces that have to be set inside of a line, that there is always a potential for them to come loose, not to stick down with whatever adhesive we're using, for us as people to mess up our positioning when we're placing something in that line. And then we have an edge that misses and doesn't look great. So hot knife makes that, not a problem, because we're just running on a full span of material, all hooped together. If we want crinoline, we hoop it all at one time and run the entire design through all of it. That's why people like hot knife. Why do I not like hot knife as much? Sometimes you get a little bit of extra material that's still visible. You have to use a careful hand to avoid spoilage, especially if you're using polyester thread. You can cut through the thread as well as you can cut through the material. That's why people sometimes use a reinforced edge too, or different thread choices for their edge so that it doesn't melt at the same rate as polyester. But I don't love that, because then the other threads may also not be as color fast or washed the same way. Can be relatively time consuming. Anybody who's started to do hot knife cutting will tell you, as simple as it looks when someone demos it, it takes longer when you're learning. And like I said, sometimes you'll see a little bit of the material outside of the border. Is there anything wrong with that? No. The other thing I don't love is when I have to release this to people in my shop. Let's say that I have operators who may or may not be as skilled or as careful as I'd like them to be. I now have them handling hot pens that they're leaving on a table that they may or may not burn themselves on, or leave on the table to burn the table or some other garment. It's not that that's something you should not be able to trust your people with, but if it's a concern for you, then rinsing, tearing out, using a heat gun for heat away materials, or using a heat press to heat away the extra material, unlike the polyolefin, just feels like it's a little less dangerous, a little less upsetting to mess with. Hot knife will definitely burn you if you grab it as it falls off the table. Heat gun, can you burn yourself? Yes. Is it less likely you're going to grab the end of a fully heated up heat gun? I sure hope so. But sometimes it's something that you got to think about. If you're cutting them out yourself and you trust your hands, then hey, there's nothing wrong with hot knife. Hot knife can be great, and especially for the ease of use. No special setup, no special digitizing, no extra borders, no applique steps, no stopping the machine. We're just running a bunch of patches and we're cutting them out. That's why people like hot knife. For soluble stabilizer, for me, I like soluble stabilizer. Number one, I like a softer patch most of the time. A lot of the stuff that I was doing, it was for TV and movies. And by and large, they weren't supposed to look brand new. They were supposed to look worn a little bit. Having a super, super crispy patch that came off incredibly hard with extra materials was not the go. The idea was stuff was supposed to look a little washed. And in fact, a lot of my stuff got distressed for the work that it was being used for. So I wanted something soft that you would sew it on and it looked like the person had been wearing that patch for a little while, and it wasn't quite as hard as a brand new patch with support materials. So for me, that was a concept. Plus, soluble stabilizers just don't require you to do any sort of post cutting. And I had access to the ability to pre-cut. I had roller fed plotters. So roll fed plotter cutters that I could use to pre-cut any materials like you see in the center of this piece. If you have a roll fed cutter, hey, Cricut also works. Any of the desktop cutters will do this as well. You can cut material that you can then drop in, and it's very easy to get a nice clean edge because you don't do any post cutting. You don't do any cutting inside the hoop necessarily. And you can just drop these things in like an applique. In this case, we're dropping a placement line onto a water-soluble or a heat-soluble stabilizer. We can use a heat-away stabilizer here. This is a water-soluble, a fibrous water-soluble that rinses away. Trade name for the craft stores type stuff, Vilene carries a good one. There's other people. Every stabilizer company has one of these washaways. The heavier one that looks like a standard stabilizer is my favorite. But in this case, you can see it is a placement line, a tack down line, once we've placed all of our materials, and then we're running the rest of the piece, we're rinsing it out. So that's the thing. You apply the base material and you rinse it out, and that's really all you have to do. So what are the pros and cons on that? You get a total, complete, clean edge because it goes over the edge of it, and when we wash that material away, it washes away entirely. There's nothing left of it. It melts entirely away. That does mean there's nothing inside of the rest of the back of the patch either. So if you do want support materials and to make it stiffer, you need to either pre-cut and place those materials and stick them in with some light embroidery adhesive, or you have to do some other post-processing. However, if you want them like this, very easy to get a rinse away patch. They are going to be thinner if you don't add support materials or crinoline or anything else to make these thicker or stiffer. They are going to be a more flexible, pliable patch. That may not be the go for you. The other thing you can do is you can apply your heat seal films and either cut them afterwards in post. You can actually use a hot knife even after you've done this just to cut the material. I've seen that done a couple times. People use it to cut the film, the heat away or the heat on adhesive layers. They've done that before. I've also seen people cut them with scissors if that's easier for you, but that does mean more manual labor after you've pressed those together. One guy I do, he really stood by doing a hot peel. He would press these into the adhesive and then rip away the excess adhesive while it's still warm. Maybe not quite as clean, but it's something that you can do. I don't think I'd necessarily recommend it, but you can do it. Depends on the material you're using, depends on the application instructions. Check out the material you're using for the application instructions. If it's really easy circles and pieces, you can also punch them out or have them pre-cut or cut your layer with a cutter. I've seen people do that too. Personally, my stuff was not stick-on, it was sew-on. So for me, this was the go for most of my stuff. Does require especially digitizing. You got to digitize like an applique. It's more efficient by far with pre-cuts. If you're hand cutting this, you got to have nice, big, thick borders, and you're going to be cutting in the hoop and trying not to unhoop that material or jostle it. And you might have to do some rinsing and drying or pressing. So at the end of this, you got to let it dry. The great thing is letting it dry, I don't have to have somebody watch it or manually handle it. So it might be worthwhile to you if you're going to grab a bunch of these patches off, rinse them out, lay them flat on a surface, on some paper towels or on something that absorbs on some felt, let them sit there and you don't have to touch them, then it might not matter to you. And that's less labor than doing the heat cutting. If that manual labor time is more important to you than being able to just run them right off of the machine and go straight into a customer's hands once I do the post-processing, then that's all right. But it does mean they have to dry out, because you're not giving a customer a handful of wet patches. So that's a con. They're wet. They got to dry or be rinsed out for sure, but they have to then dry, and they might have to be pressed flat or prepared depending on how you're working with support materials and stuff like that. So soluble stabilizer, clean edge, fairly easy to do, especially if you got a cutter to deal with any sort of the materials you might want to add. If you're going to use like a polyester twill like I'm using here, and there's just not skill involved in the same way. Hand cutting of any kind requires a steady hand. Heat cutting requires a steady hand, and it gets better and faster the longer you've done it. But this, we're using machines to handle all of our skill. And rinsing is not a skill that I think is particularly difficult to pick up. So this is something that can be very easy for people to do. It's an easy way to get a clean edge patch that looks really nice, but still could have some, like I said, has some other cons that are possible, especially in the fact that you got to digitize a particular way for them. And if you don't have a cutting set up, then you're trying to figure something else out to do pre-cuts. I will say you can do a multi-step process. You can do that. I'm going to talk about that hybrid method in a minute, and we'll discuss that. That means you don't have to have cutters, but if you have a roll-fed cutter or a laser cutter and you're good with cutting material that way, this is really a fantastic way to do it. Works well. And like I said, now we have heat away, and this works much more like the plastic method. So thick, soluble heat away stabilizers, either the polyolefin stabilizers. These are the heat away layers that you'll see that they have a little texture on them that keeps them from slipping in the hoop as much as a off-the-shelf piece of Walmart plastic. People use the tablecloth plastic pretty readily, the 20-gauge plastic. Yes, this works very much like the plastic method, but after you tear it away, a little bit of heat will shrink up and shrivel any of the little edges that are left, and it gets really nice and clear. So heat gun pressing, whatever, will get the extra little bits away and make it look real nice and clean edged without having to do the rinsing. So the great thing is now that we have the heat away polyolefin materials, that can help. The only thing is you have to treat them much more like plastic. If you perforate the edges repeatedly when you're running and you're not very careful about that until we don't run that to the last moment, some of these materials, especially if you use the thinner version of them, can try to tear away early if we perforate the edge too much or we're not very careful with how we set up our patch. So that's kind of pros and cons on that too. But the thick heat-soluble films, they're closer to using our original soluble films than they are to using the thinner plastics that were used later. Plastic substrate, another method we can use, right? We stitch the entire piece on plastic. In this case, I was proving a point. I did one that doesn't have a thick edge and stitched it on plastic. This design was actually not originally created for a patch. It's a very tiny piece. I actually have it here somewhere in front of me. I'll hold this up to the camera so you can see what I'm talking about. Very tiny little patch, really tiny little fill stitches with very small satin stitch borders. So we're talking about, 1.5 mil, real small, and it holds together very well. I've beaten this piece up, tried to rip it. As long as everything is tucked in, the fills are tucked in nicely. We have good underlays and we have nice pull compensation, everything has good overlaps, it'll hold together on a plastic substrate. It is still fairly thin. This was using the classic like fabric store method, the run to the box store and grab your 20 gauge plastic method, not something commercial. And it holds up just fine. It has held up for years and years of carrying this little patch around. So a little Valkyrie patch, if you guys were looking for, once again, is Eric doing Viking stuff? Yeah, all the time. So there's the little Valkyrie patch that you saw in that stack. The thing to remember is with the plastic stuff, you have to be careful when you edge it, and you have to be careful how much you perforate it on the edge when you start, especially the classic thinner, smooth plastics like this. They tear away a little earlier, and you got to be careful to make sure they're not going to tear away before you're ready for them to tear away. So you want to run all your central material before your border with these things because they tend to fall apart a little easier when they get perforated. I mean, that's how they tear away in the end. You can also see there is, if you look at like the chin of the Valkyrie, this is zoomed in pretty tight. You look at the chin, you look at the bottom of the necklace right here, you can see little tiny pieces of plastic that are sticking out. Unlike the heat away, the standard plastics, yeah, can use some heat to try and shrill that, sure. But the heat away, the polyolefin, the one that I just showed you a moment ago, these are meant to heat away. They heat away quite readily. Not all plastics do, and especially people start using random different kinds of plastic that they find that's about the same thickness and strength. I've seen people use every manner of dry cleaning bags in 10 layers, whatever it is that they use. Will it potentially function? Yes. Is it as good as getting yourself some nice polyolefin film from a stabilizer house, from one of the supply houses? No, it's not going to be quite as good, and it's less likely you'll have a uniform turnout. It may or may not work depending on what you're using, and applying heat to it may have different results. I mean, shrinky dinks are plastic too, and ask you how that's going to look if you shrivel up your patch by heating it up too much. But you embroider the entire span on patch on a plastic substrate, and you tear it off after the fact, and it just holds up. You just, once again, you have to make sure everything's tied in together depending on your design if you're not making it specifically for patches, or you just have to make sure that you're careful about perforations and things like that. You can also use commercial systems. This is Madeira's MFS system. It has these captive little inserts that are plastic, and they can actually be used in concert with this hoop that you're seeing here. And the hoop will let you actually sew these on, very much like I showed you previously. It'll let you sew these onto a garment directly, and they work very well with using just a thread-based only patch, which is something that you're seeing here. Thread-only patches is another method. Just to let you know, often with the plastic, because the plastic is permanent, in this case, it's not heating away necessarily. It's not moving away. It's not melting away like the solubles. You can do the plastic method, and it makes a nicer bodied patch, a heavier bodied patch when you're using thread only. Thread only is a way of using a mesh made of thread to create the entire patch. There's multiple layers of underlay that come together and a top stitching layer that then make the entire patch, the entire body of the patch that we see here, out of thread only. But when we do that with solubles, will it hold up? Yes, water solubles, it will still hold up, but the patch is exceedingly thin. It will be much more pliable once you rinse it away. Whereas if you do it on the plastics, it's fairly durable and it feels more like a standard patch with material inside. So pros and cons in general about plastic, super easy. You run the piece, you tear it out. Usually you're done. If you're using polyolefin, which is somewhat like the plastic, you heat the edges to get it nice and clean. And the edges are pretty good. Even on the plastic where we don't use heat, the plastic, the edges are pretty good. Are they perfect? Maybe not, but the edges are pretty good. They're all right. They look definitely better than cutting by hand a piece of fabric and trying to get as close as you can, which some people do. That's not going to look nearly as good as a plastic substrate. You do have to worry about the tear outs happening, so you got to be really careful with that. Also, thread-only patches. Pros and cons on thread-only patches. The biggest con ever is they are massive stitch counts because we are using thread to create the entirety of the patch. It has 3 layers of underlay with a top stitching layer on top of it. That's going to absolutely rack that thread count up like crazy. However, it means that you don't do anything. No cutting, no post-processing. All you do is let it run on the machine and tear it out. And for the cost of the time and the thread, you get a decent looking piece. The 2 pieces you're looking at here, one was done on the non-commercial tablecloth plastic, one was done on the commercial Madeira MFS system. Both of them look pretty darn good, and they have the proper colors that I needed for this particular show. The show was looking for this particular khaki. I sublimated the first version of their patches because I couldn't find a twill that they liked the color of. And in the end, I did have a thread color that they liked for it. and we ran them as these thread style patches because ultimately they look pretty similar to fabric patches. And for our money, we were getting paid well to kick out small numbers of these patches very like on a quick turnaround without a bunch of prep. This means I can make patches with any thread color I have right now, and all I lose is the time on the machine. However, time on the machine for a commercial producer is a major loss. We have to make sure we're getting paid for that time that machines are tied up. It's always going to be better to use fabric if we can for that sake, for the sake of trying to make these things efficient. But if you're a home or an art decorator and you want to make one patch that has a certain color to it, this is a fantastic way to do it. Just remember that you're going to have tens of thousands of stitches tied up in a large patch or even a medium-sized left chest patch that is going to absolutely rack up the time that your machine spends running. If it's something you get to start and do something else and you're not watching it like a hawk and the time is not the money for you, great. If you have a high markup because you're selling to someone who is cool with getting something custom and they just have to have it the right color, the right time right now, and can't wait for you to bring in fabrics from all over the place, and or they just need to have this one specific color that you cannot find in twill, but you can find in thread, then you can charge enough to make this make sense. And in that case, thread-only patches are great. The plastic substrate can be fine, especially because they're built in such a way where you can definitely put that border last. And I'll show you in a second what a couple different ways of putting the border last, even if you're using a software like Merrily that creates the patch as an object. People think that you can't have a separate border object. I will show you in a second. Of course you can, but I would be very careful with plastic methods of any kind, including the polyolefin. I really like to run the border last. The polyolefin holds up to a lot. The heavy gauge polyolefin will hold up to a tremendous amount of stitching before it tears, more than you think. But I still tend to like to run the full coverage border last on a patch that has a full edge like this, just because I'm trying not to perforate that edge any more than I have to before I'm done. I just like to leave it a little rough. I even often leave a little bit of feathering or jagged edge on the internal fills because I like to leave that border as little as I can, punctured along one fine line when we're on plastic or when we're on the polyolefin. Like I said, polyolefin holds up. The plastic, the usual suspects, kind of plastic tablecloth stuff that people usually run on. I find it can start to tear away under tension, and especially when we're throwing a tremendous amount of stitching on it like we are with the thread-only patch, you got to be careful about how much you're puncturing an area. But the pro is you can just make it out of whatever you have. Easy finishing, clear materials forgiving, pros are there, thread-based emblems in any color without materials. Also, if you have that system that allows you to hoop a garment underneath it, like I showed you earlier, the MFS, we can actually make a massive heavy decoration and not run the edge yet and then drop it on and place it perfectly with the hoop the same way we did before. Now, we can still do that with the hybrid method. I'm going to show you that in a second, but allows for heavy decoration on performance wear. Cons, especially digitizing, you're running all this stuff. The emblems are thin, massive stitch count increase, and increased potential, especially on the thinner plastics, for tearing out during the runs. So, like I said, these are the things that we usually talk about. These are the substrate methods we have. We've got the soluble method. We've got the plastic method. We have the heat cut method. However, there is one more method that I often don't talk about, and that is really the hybrid method of patch creation, right? So what I mean by the hybrid method is exactly this, that we're essentially doing a hybrid of two processes. It's a multi-stage process that allows us not to do the heaviest amount of decorating on the thinner plastic materials, or to use a decorated patch and or applique item and then put it directly on a garment without having a loose edge or without sewing through the entirety of the garment. So the hybrid method in this case is really simple to explain, and I'll show it to you. Unfortunately, I've got a little bit of weirdness with my gallery, but I'll try and show it to you anyway. The hybrid method is creating the inner patch blank first, the material. And when I say blank, what I mean is stitching the entirety of what is inside of the patch before we add the edge and cutting it in between. And in the case of making a one-off, maybe you're doing a strike-off that you're eventually going to have produced, or you're somebody who's making just one piece of your own and you don't have a roll-fed cutter, you don't have a laser, and you're just trying to make one piece, sometimes this can be a really great way to do it. And in the case of this kind of piece, I did this with one of my patches I did recently for an article, showing some techniques that you'll be seeing more from me later about some techniques that I used in this piece. And what you can see is I'm on standard stabilizer. This is a standard cutaway stabilizer that I'm using here. I have a piece of decent polyester twill, white polyester twill. And what I've done essentially is I've run this full stack just like a span. Now I'm only doing one piece for a strike off in this case. I'm doing one piece for a sample. So I decided, you know what? I'm just going to literally do this with a scissor. I run the existing material. I didn't even put an extra line for a cut line because I figured the cut line wasn't all that necessary because I was cutting right to the edge of this fill stitch. And all I was trying to do, this one is a little harder because if I cut the edge of that fill stitch, I could cause myself some problems with tearing out, with snipping that fill and having the threads come back. But I knew I had a nice big cover stitch, and I'm going to use a nice big cover border to attach this later or to edge this on the soluble material. So let's say I had a design that had a bunch of stitching that has to be done in the middle, tons of detail, tons of heavy work. I stitch it all on a full span, but instead of having to do the hot cut at the end, instead of having the possibility of having that edge come out or having some other issues that I don't like or having to do the hot cutting and having a little bit of the material left, after the first stage, I can either hot cut or I can use a scissor or something like this. If I have some other way of positioning the laser, I could do that too if I wanted to. But in this case, just making one, I thought, forget it. I have a nice sharp scissor. I'm going to go ahead and use my nice sharp scissor and cut this thing out once. And what I make essentially is this, which is the internal portion of the patch, all finished, separated out, that has the stabilizer in it. And also, if I were trying to do some stability material like a crinoline, I could either sew through it or I could cut it out. I could put it on the stack. I could even do, depending on your adhesive, you might have adhesive that would hold up. You could press that too and cut this all together before it's edged. And this is often what a patch would look like that's about to go into a mirroring machine, right? It's done. It has some kind of edge on it. It's cut out, but now we don't have that final edge. Well, the last thing I do is add the edge. And how do I add the edge? By doing it like an applique, by putting a placement line down, sticking this down on my soluble stabilizer, on my plastic, something of that nature, and then moving on from there. So how did I actually achieve it? I stuck it down with a placement line. I treat it like an applique, but on the plastic, on the layer that I'm eventually trying to run on. So like I said, this is essentially giving me a chance to work on the piece, have all the central stuff done, and then the final edging, the final piece that I'm doing, I'm going to do on the plastic, and I'm going to do that after placing it down, and I don't have to run all of the rest of the heavier material. Let's imagine that that was all full of design elements and stuff that was difficult, that was going to be a lot of distortion. I can do that all on standard stabilizer, cut it out, and then edge it last. And I'll show you more about what I'm talking about in a second here. But in essence, I did this one strike off. I did it on a single needle style machine because I was just trying to get this done. And I'll just kind of show you what I'm talking about real quick, because I've got some other pictures we can rely on. And like I said, did it on a little single needle machine because I had to run this off at the house. I wasn't with my multi at the time, so I went ahead and just did it. This one piece, you run a placement line. Run a placement line just like you really would. You stick this piece down your placement line, run the tack down stitching. Once the tack down's all done, we start edging it. Edge that piece, run all your edging across it, and then we are there in the hoop, edged. And the only thing that we stitched through this plastic stabilizer level, the only thing that we stitched through that film, that potentially torn film, is the edging. So in the hybrid method, it means we just pre-cut it before we do the edge. We have to go ahead and leave ourselves enough room for coverage on that. And I'll show you the file in a second to kind of give you the idea of that. But we do the edging as a separate file after the fact. It's got a placement line. We place our pre-cut patch that has all the embroidery done in the middle. And then we edge it and just tear that away. And we don't end up with plastics that can tear away quite as easily. And the other thing we can do is, like I showed you earlier, if I wanted to put that directly on a garment, I could run the placement line on the garment, stick that down with some embroidery-specific adhesive, and then I could tack it down and edge it on the garment with a direct edge or a satin stitch and make a piece that looked like it was stitched in place, but was instead actually a hybrid method. It was actually an applique that was pre-stitched. So the great thing about that too is if we mess up the stitching on the applique, we don't mess up an entire garment. If we have a garment with a tremendous amount of texture, you could totally do this on a heavy textured garment. Once we get into outerwear in the fall, you could have a heavily textured garment, knock down some of that area and then put this on top of it and border that piece with a nice big wide border and have this lovely big thick patch, but it wouldn't smash down every little bit of the fibers and you wouldn't have to deal with that stuff because it would just have that nice patch, but it would have a clean edge that was sewing through the rest of the garment. So the hybrid method can be used either for producing a pre-decorated patch style applique on direct embroidered garments, or we can use it to enable us to create an edge without having to sew all of our material through the piece. And this can be done commercially. This can be done on larger spans. Certainly, I would say you're not going to do a big span of edges on plastic because the more of those you do, we're going to probably hoop those separately. If we have a big span of the polyolefin, I think the more and more we edge that stuff, the more likely it is we're going to get loose in a larger span of polyolefin material or plastic substrate, especially if you're doing the classic, you're doing the classic grabbing the tablecloth covered plastic from the old Walmart or box store or whatever it is in your locale. Those are not going to hold up to quite so much. But if you're just edging a patch, especially you're doing a strike off, and what I mean by that is like a single piece, a piece that will justify the rest of the work. So we show this to a customer, have a lovely piece, and then we can have it produced in a different way. Those are very useful to do quickly and have a nice clean edge. Or you're just doing a few pieces for very small runs. I can see that being a useful way to handle it. But it does at least allow you to create that without having quite as much stress. And I have seen people put multiple patches in a span of plastic. I just generally don't recommend it, or I warn people that there's a potential to tear out after you keep running over and over in the span of plastic, especially the larger hoops when you have that plastic spanned up, depending on the plastics you use or the substrates you use. Eventually, you can see some weakness or some loosening of that, and then you can see shifting. But like I said, it's something where you can add that border effect. I think the hybrid can be a great way to handle it. So let me take a look here. We got some other comments here. So I'm going to grab some comments before I show you the file and run you through it, and then we'll call it a day on both of these things. Remember, if you want to do another Q&A episode, please send in your questions. Go to any of my socials and contact me directly there, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, wherever you find me. LinkedIn, you can contact me there as well. Or go to the contact page at the top of ericcampbell.com, and you can let me know if you have questions you'd like to be in a future Q&A. But let me go ahead and grab some comments before we finish up here. Zero says, are there any other machines that make the Mero Edge? I know there are other Mero-like machines that are not made by the Mero company, but not so much. This is what I mean by that. People will always say, hey, can I use a serger? I got an old serger laying around. Can I do something to make a tighter edge? Yeah, but is it going to look like the Mero Edge? Not really. So if you want to do a manual version of that, really, I think the Mero machine is the good one to go on. I know there are other import machines that are similar. I won't name them off because I haven't used them. The only ones I've used personally or had used in my shops were actual Mero machines, the MG3U. So those were the ones that I know. But at the same time, most of my patches I did with the custom borders, because actually a lot of my patches had holes in them or deep insets or stuff that didn't really work for the Mero machine. I did a lot of solubles or hot cut pieces that would have insets, holes, or really fine details. So what some people would call a perfect edge patch, something that has to be heat cut or used in some other way, soluble method to get those kind of deep insets, inset holes, things like that. Mike says, love patches, best margin in a shop. Applique is a close second. After the full board came along, haven't done a plain satin edge since. Yeah, no, I used to do the here's what I will say though. I used to do the motif style borders that very much like what Jeff then came up with and worked on for many years. But what I'm going to tell you is I had more issues making those work quickly for customers. I just thought that I had to do a lot more manual work on them. So I did do a lot of satin edge as well, but I do love a textured border, and Jeff's is a really great textured border. So is the textured border in Stitch Artist 3, takes all the trouble of cornering yourself. So if you're someone who's not a digitizer, doesn't want to mess around with getting those perfect edges like Jeff does, or like I used to do, Stitch Artist 3 or Merrily, if you don't mind just producing either the custom shapes that are in there or the wrap shape, we'll do all those corners and it's great. So I do love a textured border that looks like Mero. I'll show you. That's the one that I did, and I'll bring back up the piece. If you want to see one that was done by the Stitch Artist engine, well, that's what we're talking about here. Jeff's is different. It has more of a chain stitch like detail on the inside edge. It has some lovely texture to it. So go check out Jeff's stuff too. The fuller border that he does is a very cool border based on a motif stitch, very similar to this, but this is the one that's automated through Stitch Artist 3, or in this case, Merrily does this one. This is a page wrap in the Merrily product. So literally, I dropped in my warped envelope text. I click page wrap, and this is what I get. Immediately, I have a patch that's made up. So now it's available for people who aren't having to do like me or Jeff does, where we do these meticulous, awesome cornering and stuff. Well, you can do an automatic version that makes it work very well. So love that. But yeah, as you can see, the Merrily border is pretty cool too. Go check out Jeff's. I don't have a picture of his, but Fuller Embroidery Works is where he is. Go check him out. Fuller Embroidery Works. He has some pre-done ones, and I know he also does custom ones for people too. If you just want to have one made and you're not going to make a bunch for yourself, then that's also a great option, is to have a fine digitizer who does a good job make your border for you. But yeah, love that stuff. And Mike says pop-outs are where it's at. Yeah, pop-outs, the plastic patches, and especially, like I said, the new polyolefin substrates. If you're going to do detailed patches that have a lot of work on them, but you still want the plastic pop-out, those hold up to a lot more abuse. So Santi says, what do you think the best company for patch fabric is? I'm just going to be awful and say that anybody who's going to give you plastic or polyester twill that's good for you that you can get. I'm not saying they're ideal or identical. I used to use Stahl's tackle twill because it worked in my roll-fed plotter cutter, but a lot of people don't like how shiny it is. But for me, it works like a sticker. It's pressure sensitive. I could stick it down when I was doing those placement line style patches on soluble materials, and so that's what I used. Would I use that now? Not as much. You can still use Stahl's material because Stahl's has great polyester twill. Some of it's shinier. There's tons of other people. Embroidery nerds sell their own. I know somebody told me John Deere was selling some that have a crinoline already backed onto them that he calls patch fabric, but it's still polyester twill with crinoline attached to it. Honestly, as long as it's nice fine-grained polyester twill and you've got a method to cut it that works for you, you're probably going to be okay. Other people use other materials. I cannot tell you how many times somebody told me, like, get Recacryl outdoor material. It's like a sunbrella type of material. It's something that will hold up to the sun. I haven't used it. People say they love it. I've used every manner of other patch materials. For me, a good polyester twill slice of some kind will work. But any other stabilized material that'll cut cleanly for you will work for a patch. The one thing I will say is, don't think that just because you want a thicker patch or a stiffer patch that you have to use coarse material. Cotton ducks and heavy canvas are going to deflect your needle, and then fine detail work is not going to be as available. And in fact, the other funny thing is the kind of patch material that they sell in craft stores and home stores for patching garments. I picked this up because I thought it was kind of funny, and I was just joking around. I thought, big box store, Simplicity has patches that are meant to go on your garments when they get torn. And I picked it up looking at it because I was like, what is that? And I'm like, it's polyester twill, and it looks just like the patch twill that I used to use. It's super expensive for these punched out rounded rectangles. But I got this because somebody was like, I want to get into patches, but I don't know what to do. And all I have is big box stores. I'm in a rural area. And I'm like, pick up some of this. It'll work. Because I used it to make a couple patches just to prove a point. I was like, if you're in a rural area, but you've got an embroidery machine and you can get to the big box store, you still have enough polyester, both in the fabric section. And like I said, if you're doing a name patch and you're not too worried about it and you want to stick it on with heat, you could border one of these suckers or cut a piece out like I just showed you and run a name in a border and then iron it on. It would still work. Now, is that what you would do in a commercial shop? Heck no. But the thing is, if you got to make one and you need polyester twill, there's a lot of different ways you can get it. And there's some rounded rectangles that are pre-cut. Size those up in your Stitch Artist 3 software, run some rounded rectangles or do it in Merrily, and you could use those suckers to make name patches all day and not cut anything. Does it work? Yes. The thing is, there's more ways to skin a cat here than we need to. And I don't like that term. I got a lot of lovely little fuzzy cats in my house. There are more ways that we can solve this problem than just the one. I used a commercial roll-fed plotter cutter to make most of my patches. When I couldn't do that, I had some hand cuts, and I've done some hot cut as well. I've done some hot knife cutting myself. Most of the time, roll-fed's what we do. But at the same time, can you do it in other materials? Yeah. One of the great things is now the type of craft cutters that are out there have a glue tray to them. They have essentially a board that is glued down. They call it multiple different things, which is why I'm not using one term, but you stick things down to a tray and then cut. Back when I was doing this stuff first, my roll-fed cutter, I had to buy a product called Magic Mask, which is essentially a plastic carrier sheet, and I would stick down specialty materials to that and roll them flat and squeegee them on so they would cut, and then run them through my drag knife cutter. Also, if you had back in the day the Ioline 300, lovely cutter that has a nice big glue tray style setup. The funny thing is it's like the precursor giant version of the craft cutters because it had a big tray that you stuck stuff down to, and it was used for applique all day long. The other thing people use, and I know, Mike, you'll know this too, clinkers. A clinker is a press that cuts out shapes. You have pre-made dies, and you just cut through the fabric shapes with these pre-made cutter dies, and you just clink them down with pressure. And they cut through bunches of layers of material. If you have a bunch of standard shapes you're doing, people use clinkers all the time. So it really depends on how you're doing it. The thing is, all we have to figure out is, how are we cutting it? How are we edging it? And how are we getting a clean edge? There's multiple ways to go about it. And the pros and cons really is just about how you're equipped, the kind of patches you're going to do all the time, and what makes the most sense for you all the time. And yeah, Mike, you're right. You can use a Cricut. If you know how to get your roller set up correctly, you can use a Cricut sticky mat in a roll fed cutter that doesn't really have one. But yeah, you can do that for sure. Dennis says, and thanks, Dennis, for tuning in and for giving us these comments as well. Hybrid is great on those medium density designs. Absolutely. I used to do a lot on heavy designs that need to adjust the placement and cover appropriately. Awesome when you get it perfectly afterward. Yeah, hybrid, when it's just set up right and you get it rolling, is a lovely thing. The hybrid method lets a lot happen, but you're right. The heavier design is, and that's something I want to bring up too. I showed you guys this patch material. The one thing I'm going to warn you about with this stuff is really thin. If you go grab the stuff off the rack, and even the poly twill from Stahl's, the pressure sensitive, it's really thin. It doesn't have a lot of body to it. And so if I jump a bunch of fills, and I do fills with a bunch of satins on top of them and detail work and a bunch of stuff into it, and if I don't have it fully hooped, I'm going to see a bunch of distortion on it. And honestly, it's lovely as fine grain, because then the texture doesn't make any problem for you. But then if it's really thin and very densely woven as it is, it's very opaque. You can't see through it. It's a lot of fibers really close together. As we punch our needle through it, we're going to be moving those fibers around, and it's going to warp up and stuff, and it's going to pucker. And if you have a piece that has a ton of work on it, let's say that I did a placement line and just stuck this down and I don't have anything else. I didn't adhere it. I didn't pre-fuse it. I just lay it down and start stitching through it without it being in the hoop. It's going to pucker and move. So be aware of that. The one thing I will say is more slop, more exaggerated borders are going to work better for this method, because then if you're a little off to one side or another, it's not going to kill you. If you're under a millimeter off in your variance, even a little bit more than that, it's absolutely not going to kill your piece. So last thing I'm going to do before I let you go, I'm going to go ahead and show you, if I can, the specific file I was talking about, and just give you the hybrid kind of speech one more time, just to show you what I'm talking about, since it was something people said, hey, I didn't catch what you meant by this hybrid thing. What are you trying to do? Well, this is what it looks like. This is the piece that we're looking at, the My Karma Ran Over My Dogma patch. You'll see more of stuff like this later, because I'm working on a project that has some of these things involved. But in essence, this piece has, it had an essential placement line first, because in the case of this particular piece, not very heavy. It's got a nice light fill in the background that I used that held down the material. So I did just lay this down in the hoop. I didn't use any other sort of material on top of it. I hooped it up, laid it in. 2 of the edges were held. The other 2 were not, because I was using one of these pieces of patch material, like I said, to prove a point that you could just do it with whatever you had on hand. And I ran that down. So I stuck it down and then filled right on top of it. And what you see here is a gradient curved fill. It was just kind of some cool texture to add to the patch. So it's just something I wanted to play with. I think that my patch, actually, I could have used slightly better color choices on this, but gradient curved fill was just kind of a cool texture to put in the background. And then we have the My Karma Ran Over My Dogma envelope warp text here, which is cool. So it's nice psychedelia, but this is the end of it. Could I have put another placement line or something on top of the piece for a good cut line? I could have, probably should have, but I just cut it close and didn't worry too much about it, because the second part of it was the edging piece. And the edging piece is just another one of these patch lines. You can see this is the Stitch Artist 3 or Merrily border. In this case, it's Merrily that made this particular piece. But what you can see is this is just a border piece. It has a placement line, and then it has a little tack down, and it does the final Merrily style faux marrowed edge border on the piece that's got the automatic cornering and curvature. So in this case, I've essentially made 2 patch files. But if you look at this piece, the initial patch piece that's on here, if you're using Stitch Artist, it has these multiple things you can do, these interactives where the top stitching is there, and you're like, oh man, but now the top stitching is underneath the other stuff, and I have only 1 patch item. How am I going to fix this? Well, the truth of the matter is, and here I can do a fabric preview. It's the wrong color, but you can see what I'm talking about. You turn off all the top stitching, and your first patch setup is just the positioning, and you set it at cut with complete, and you don't have to worry about it. Why? All I want is this same shape. I copy this shape off, I paste it again at the end, and I have my top stitching on, and now we can see what it looks like. But I want to do this in 2 files, so I'm going to cut that patch off. I'm going to go ahead and start up my new file, and if this was empty, if you don't change anything about it, you just go ahead and paste it right in. We're in the same position as far as the starting XY kind of point, and we actually have exactly that same thing. And instead of having the top stitch turned off, we have the top stitch turned back on, and we have a position line because we're going to use that position line to stick down our hybrid piece. So we essentially end up with 2 files, but really it's coming out of the same shape. People really get kind of confounded because they see when they have a patch border like this, they're like, oh, well, I could, with this patch border, do all the different things. My position is here. I want to create it with a light fill, which means I could put one of these textured fills in the background here. So this is a 50% textured fill. Or let's say I want to be even a little more controlled about it. I can go ahead and even drop that density further and say I want less than that. I want a 1/4 density fill just to give it some cool texture. And yes, that's all automated in one piece, and we can do that. But what it does mean is our edge is running at the same time as the patch. And if I wanted to then run text or something on top of that, you might not want that. Great thing is, all I have to do is copy and paste. So let's say we have that one piece. Yes, this interactive allows you to do all the stitching at once, but you can also just take that off. We only do our placement stuff and our little fill. We copy it, we paste it, same item is there, and we have our top stitching and our position, and we turn off this light fill. We don't want that anymore. So our light fill is no longer inside of that shape, as we can see, and then anything can go between the two. We can put whatever text or whatever in between these 2 items you want. This is the same thing with applique tools in any software. If you want to do your applique and do the border last, like let's say we have some sort of text or item we want to run underneath this edge, like for whatever reason, let's say we're working on this piece and we want that text to run under the border or a stripe to go from side to side and be under the entire border. That is really not a problem. So let's just say we wanted to do that. We want a stripe that's going to go across this piece and land at the final border here. We're going to have a satin stitch done with that piece. And we're like, man, I want it to run under the border. No big deal. Separate the patch, copy it and paste it so that you can actually run it under the border. And then, of course, make sure it's actually only running under the border here and not out to the absolute edge. But that means that we can do things like have fields of different color, any sort of edges that run under our final automated border. And you can do that with applique tools too. There's so many people who will use an applique tool in software. They'll bring in like a true type font, click the applique tool and get rolling. And they don't realize that you can just copy and paste it and turn off individual sections. No matter what software you're in, they'll have some matter of way to handle that. And it means that you can do detailed stuff, colored fills, different kinds of fills, multiple areas of color inside of the patch, and have it run under the edge and just copy and paste and only run the top stitching last. So just because everything can be done with one object doesn't mean you have to. And like I said, the hybrid method is a great way to handle it. So that's, one of those things you can do. And also, Mike says, oh my God, 2 working files in 1 working space would be a dream for multi-file projects. What I'm also going to tell you is, pardon me, guys. What I'm also going to tell you is actually, if I were doing this in StitchArtist, I actually can output individual designs that way. You could do that in a different way if you had the designs compressed. It doesn't work the same way with the lettering objects, but you can actually do multiple working files in the same space, or at least you can output multiple designs that are in this design tree as different output files. You can do that with an export routine out of StitchArtist 3. It's not in everything. But the method that I just showed you is the way that works for every software, where you copy and paste and you can just have multiple pieces that layer together nicely. But I'll go ahead and pull the software down and put myself back up. But yeah, 2 working files in 1 space would be awesome, especially if we could have the export routines. If all softwares did a version of that, that would be really cool, because multi-process pieces, or if you guys saw recently on my Instagram, I had a multi-process piece where I stitched on I stitched a dragonfly where the body of the dragonfly was flat, and then I put in 3D wings that I had pre-stitched and then stitched the body in there, like tacked them down, stitched the body over them to give these cool 3D lace wings on a jacket back that I did. Having that as like a process in one file, I could totally see that being something interesting. But I guess the takeaway for this is, no matter what it is you're doing, whether it's patches or something else, remember that you can do a multi-step method, and that not all steps have to be in the same file. And definitely if we're doing something like applique or patches that have an automated object in your software, no matter what software that is, because I know applique software or the applique tool, like Melka Design Shop, I know they also use their applique tool to make patches in a way, or at least it's an applique-like routine that they use. There's multiple softwares that do this. If you're using a tool that has multiple steps, like an applique tool or a patch edge tool, the chances are you can turn on and off pieces and stack those layers together, and that you can separate those out and output multiple files so that we can do these in multiple processes. Or the other thing you totally could do as well with that piece I just showed you with the hybrids is run a big span of the hybrids, either hot cut or scissor cut them all, and then one at a time do attachments or edging. So that because we can use the span of fabric and do an entire span of fabric in a sash frame or in a big hoop, the fabric is going to be more stable. We could run multiple patches all at once to do all the interior material, then cut them all out and edge them one at a time. And it would just keep us from having to do one patch at a time like you might do if you're doing it all in one big process. All right, folks, so that was an extra long one. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you guys showing up and staying. If you have any questions, Q&A, please hit me with those either in the comments if you're in the replay squad, or if you are here live, hit me with those. Ask me what you want to. We will do another Q&A to wrap things up later. But honestly, it's been great being with you, and I can't wait to talk shop again with you folks next week.